All right, let's get going on today's meeting. So what we're going to be doing today is we are going to continue to dive deep into chapter 13, judgment, decisions, and reasoning. So this is part 2 of our look at those 3 aspects of human cognition. And before we begin, I'm going to just give you an example of what we talked about last time, which is normative reasoning versus descriptive reasoning. What should people do versus what people actually do? And one classic example of this is a paradox known as Burden's donkey. And this was a normative description of reasoning that seemed to make very little real world sense. And the idea was that if you had a hypothetical donkey, and that donkey was exactly equidistant between 2 identical stacks of hay. So it was the same distance from 2 stacks of hay. Both stacks of hay were equally tasty. Both stacks of hay were equally sized. Everything about them was equal. If that donkey was a rational animal, it would starve to death because it would have no way of making a decision between one or the other stacks of hay. So it would have no way of choosing the stack on the left, no way of choosing the stack on the right. So unable to make that decision, if it was a completely rational entity, it would just starve to death. Now, that clearly doesn't happen, or so I thought in the real world, because I did see this example once. So if anybody might have seen this video, this was a social media challenge where 2 owners of a dog would run in opposite directions, and then they would see which person the dog loved more by basically which person the dog ran after. And this is as close to Burden's donkey as I've ever seen in the real world. So once again, choice between 2 options. And the choice is to basically not make a choice. So again, sometimes when you come up with theories of the human mind, a lot of times, especially in the normative versus descriptive reasoning ideas, we'll come up with a logical idea of how things should work or logically would work, such as Burden's donkey's paradox. And then our job as cognitive psychologists is to, number one, find out what is actually happening with a human mind, or in this case, an animal mind, and then explain the difference. And sometimes, as you see, there just really is no difference, and we get that unexpected finding that, yeah, maybe there are times when this type of a decision would lead you to make a decision between, or not be able to make a decision between those 2 alternatives. All right, human mind, weird and wonderful stuff. So what we're going to do today is we're going to do a quick recap on just the basic ideas of human reasoning, normative and descriptive. Then we're going to dive deep into one very tricky aspect of human reasoning, which is conditional syllogisms. We're going to take up that CogLab number 12, Wayson's selection task. And then if we still got time, we're going to do an analysis of the reflecting on confirmation bias assignment that you were asked to complete. So just by way of a quick recap for human reasoning, once again, there are 2 sort of aspects of human reasoning that we are interested in as psychologists. The first one is normative reasoning. This is what a human should do. This is basically what is the ideal rational solution. And this is oftentimes based on philosophy, based on logic, based on mathematics, based on crunching the numbers and doing a logical analysis of things and figuring out what is the actual best decision to make. On the other hand, we have what humans actually do, which is the descriptive reasoning. And this is what we're really trying to understand. Because as psychologists, we're really hoping to understand, how does the human mind work? So normative reasoning is oftentimes seen as a starting position. Like, let's take a look at this situation and we know what the right answer is. And then descriptive reasoning is figuring out what humans actually do based on their behaviors, and then trying to figure out, based on the differences between normative and descriptive reasoning, what are the strategies that humans are actually using, what representations are our mind implementing in order to create that descriptive reasoning situation. And then we took a look at deductive reasoning and the idea that deductive reasoning goes from generalities, all swans are white, to a particular conclusion, this bird is white. And the very important idea that if premise one and premise two and all the premises are true, then if you have a valid argument, if it is logically sound, if it is logically valid, that guarantees that your conclusion must be true. So again, if the first premise and the second premise and all premises are true, a valid deductive reasoning argument will guarantee 100% that the conclusion must be true. And then we looked at a real world example of this when we took a look at debates and discussions around the gender pay gap and the idea that we still don't have 100% in terms of, we still have zero, we don't have zero as the gender pay gap. There's still a gap. And in this case, women median annual earnings being 82% of male median annual earnings. And we took a look at the argument for this and basically just generally laid it out. And premise one is that if abilities are equal across gender, premise two, interests are equal across gender, premise three, the system for hiring, promotion, and compensation is fair and unbiased. If those three premises are true, then the conclusion is basically guaranteed, then pay will be equal across genders. So if those three, again, premises are true, this is a logically sound, valid argument, the conclusion is guaranteed if those three premises are true. And we know that because of valid reasoning. What that means is that if we have a situation where we know the conclusion is not true, then the only conclusion that we can come to about this conclusion, kind of doing inception conclusions here, but the only thing we can reason about this conclusion, if it is false, is that one of the premises has to be false, and at least one of the premises has to be false. So in this situation here, oftentimes people will make the argument that the reason that we don't have that conclusion being true, the reason that there's not equal pay across genders, isn't because of premise one. Premise one is true, and premise two is also true. So if those two are true, then the false premise has to be premise number three, that the system for hiring, promotion, and compensation is fair and unbiased. And this is one side of this particular argument. On the other hand, it is also quite possible that that conclusion is false, not because premise three is false. Premise three could actually be true. The system could be fair for hiring, promotion, and compensation, and it could be unbiased. But if premise one or premise two, abilities are equal or interests are equal across gender, if those are false, then that could cause the unequal pay across genders. And again, that is the other side of the particular argument. So basically, you have one side of the argument arguing that premise three is false and premise one and two are true. You have the other side arguing that premise one and two are false, but premise three is true. And what a lot of people miss is the possibility that actually all three of them are false. So it is quite possible that all three of these are actually false. And once you realize that, then what this becomes is actually less of an argument in terms of, is this situation true or is this situation true? Because a lot of energy and a lot of time and a lot of effort is being spent arguing about whether it's premise three, that is the false premise, hiring, promotion, and compensation is not fair, or is it premise one and two that are the false premises, abilities are equal across genders, interests are equal across genders. And if people could realize that the probability is that all three of these are false, then if you want to address the gender pay gap and you want to alleviate some of the gender pay gap, you can take a look at those three premises and you can say, you know what, if all three of these premises are false, then which are the ones that we can actually do something about? So can we do anything about abilities being equal across genders? Can we do anything about interests being equal across genders? Can we do anything about the system for hiring, promotion, compensation being fair and unbiased? It basically directs you away from arguing about which one of these premises is true and just accepting that they're probably all false And if that's the case, then you have three different directions that you can go to potentially, depending upon how malleable abilities and interests are, to fix or address this gender pay gap. All right, so that was a quick recap. What we're going to do today is we're going to dive into conditional syllogisms. And these are statements of the form if P then Q. So this is a classical reasoning atom or molecule of reasoning. This is like a classical proposition that comes up again and again in reasoning. So statements like if you study, then you will get a good grade. More importantly, for a lot of us, if theory X is true, then prediction Y should occur. And this is basically all of scientific theorizing. So if you want to be a psychologist, if you want to be in that area where you are looking at theories and making predictions, it's incredibly important to understand how these conditional syllogisms work. And it's incredibly important to learn what the normative reasoning is and not fall for, as we're going to see, the incorrect descriptive reasoning that humans do. So the if part, the P part is called the antecedent. When I learned this, I'm just remembering this, when I learned this, the TA that taught this particular section, he would say the if part is called P for antecedent, and the then part is called Q for consequent. Makes no sense, but at least it's one way to remember it. All right, so we have the if part, we have the then part. There are two types of valid conditional arguments. There are four things that you can do with a conditional syllogism. Two of them are right, two of them are wrong. So we'll take a look at the two types of valid conditional arguments first. And the first one is called affirming the antecedent. If you want to get really fancy in Latin with it, this is called modus ponens. And this is exactly what it says on the tin. This is where you affirm the antecedent. This is where you start with the conditional syllogism. You always start with that if P then Q, but then you affirm the antecedent. You say, yes, the antecedent is true. P is true. So the reason this one is called affirming the antecedent is because premise 2 is exactly that. Premise 2 is saying, yes, P is true. And if premise 1 is true, if P then Q, and premise 2 is true, P is actually true, then the only conclusion that follows from that is that Q has to be true. So to put this in non-abstract terms, premise 1, if you study, then you will get a good grade. Premise 2, you study. If those two premises are true, it is guaranteed that you will get a good grade. Now, one thing that I oftentimes find derails students when they're trying to wrap their minds around conditional syllogisms and just the ins and outs of conditional syllogisms is falling into the trap of arguing against the premises being true. So as I mentioned last time, you might take a look at that premise number 1 and you might say, you know what? If you study, then you will get a good grade. That's not true. There are many situations where you can study and not get a good grade. Maybe you studied the wrong chapter. Maybe the exam was horribly unfair. Maybe you studied and then by some freak of probabilities, you ended up late at the exam and you couldn't take it. Lots of reasons why if you study in the real world, you would not get a good grade. However, when we're talking about logic and arguments and conditional syllogisms, you proceed as if both of these are true. So if you study, then you will get a good grade. You might disagree, but for the purposes of this analysis, you would say, all right, I'll go with it. The same way that older child in the previous example, when they said if a glass gets hit with a feather, it breaks, you see the look on her face, she didn't believe it at all, but she said, all right, I'll go with it. So we're going to go with premise 1. We're going to go with premise 2. And if those two are true, you will get a good grade. So basically, if you study, then you will get a good grade. If you study, you will get a good grade. That is only the way that it can go. So if P then Q, if you study, then you will get a good grade is true, and you study, you will definitely get a good grade. All right, so that's the first type of valid conditional argument. The second type is called denying the consequent, and this one is called modus tollens. So we had modus ponens for affirming the antecedent, modus tollens for denying the consequent. And this is where, again, you start with that if P then Q. That is the first premise. That's what makes it a conditional syllogism argument. We start with if P then Q, and now we follow up with the second premise that Q is false. So Q did not happen. Q is not true. Q is actually false. If that is the case, logically, the only conclusion you can make is that P is also false. So to put it back in study terms, if you study, then you will get a good grade. If that is true, and then you did not get a good grade, so both those premises are true. If you study, then you will get a good grade, but you did not get a good grade. The only conclusion is that you did not study. So if studying leads to a good grade, if that is true, and there are no exceptions, again, we're taking the if P then Q statement as being true. If you study, then you get a good grade is true, and you did not get a good grade, then it is impossible that you studied. Because if you studied, you would have ended up with a good grade. So the only way to get to that not good grade is for you not to have studied. And that is called denying the consequent. So those are the two types of valid conditional arguments. Those are the two types of correct additional arguments. Those are the two types of normative reasoning that you can do with conditional syllogisms. However, there are two other possibilities that sound correct often, but actually are incorrect. And these are the two types of invalid conditional arguments. So these invalid conditional arguments are not logical, they're not normative, they are incorrect. So the first one is affirming of the consequent. So you'll know that these ones are incorrect because they don't get fancy Latin terms. So affirming of the consequent, we start with if P then Q. We follow up with Q is true. And we incorrectly make the conclusion that P must be true as well. So in this case, back to the study example, if you study, then you will get a good grade. Once again, we take that as 100% true, error-free, no exceptions. If you study, then you will get a good grade. Premise number two, you get a good grade. And people are tempted to incorrectly conclude based on those two premises that you studied. And the reason this doesn't work is because it might be true that if you study, you will get a good grade. And it might be true that you actually did a good grade, that you actually got a good grade. And this might be because you studied to get your good grade, but there could also be another reason why you got that good grade. So maybe you actually cheated off of somebody who did get a good grade and did study and did know what they were doing, and that led to your good grade. So because it's possible to get to that good grade in other ways besides studying, we cannot guarantee the truthfulness of that conclusion. We cannot guarantee based on if you study, then you will get a good grade and you got a good grade. That cannot guarantee that you actually studied because you might have arrived to that good grade from different means, which doesn't invalidate the rule that if you study, then you will get a good grade, because if you cheat, then you get a good grade is a different rule, and that's the one that's being applied here. So again, we can't guarantee the conclusion that P is true, that you studied. This is an invalid argument called affirming the consequent. All right, and the last one, invalid, not the right way to reason, is called denying the antecedent. And this one says, if P, then Q, we start with that again. This time we say that P is false. P didn't occur. And if P is false, we are oftentimes tempted to, again, it seems to make sense to conclude that, well, if that's the case, then Q must be false as well. And this is an error because it is not guaranteed based on those two premises that Q is actually false. So let's set this up one last time with that study example. If you study, then you will get a good grade. Again, we accept that as being true. Premise number two, you did not study. We also accept that as being true, but we cannot then conclude that you will not get a good grade. And again, we can take the rule as being true. If you study, then you will get a good grade. We can take the fact that you did not study as being true as well, but that does not guarantee that you would get a bad grade In fact, it's quite possible that you do get a good grade, once again, because you used other means in order to achieve that good grade. So denying the antecedent, saying that P is false, saying that you did not get a good grade, does not guarantee that P is false, that you did not study, does not guarantee that Q is false as well, that you did not get a good grade. All right, so those are the conditional syllogisms, the 4 types of arguments. So again, we take a look at our normative versus descriptive reasoning. And if we are logical, if our minds work in a logical, normative way, then what we should do, what we should accept, the arguments that we should use are going to be affirming the antecedent. If P, then Q, P is true, Q has to be true, and denying the consequent. If P, then Q, Q is false, P has to be false. We should accept those. We should not accept affirming the consequent. If P, then Q, Q is true, so P must be true, or denying the antecedent. If P, then Q, P is false, Q must be false. We should not accept those. That's what logic tells us we should do. Now, as cognitive psychologists, we have to ask ourselves, well, how do humans actually reason? And for that, we're going to take a look at the Wason selection task. So this was Cog Lab number 12. And in this Cog Lab, on each trial, you were given a rule, and then you were shown 4 cards. And your task was to pick the 2 cards that you needed to look at to decide if the rule is being violated. So you had to make a decision about which 2 cards you would check to see what was basically on the other side, and whether or not you chose the 2 correct cards, or whether or not you made an error and chose one of the incorrect cards. So you would see something like this. If a card has a vowel on one side, it must have an even number on the other side. So in this case, you take a look at this if P then Q statement, and you ask yourself, all right, do I check card has a vowel on one side? Do I check the E? Do I check card does not have a vowel on one side? I'll check the F. Do I check has an even number, which means you have to check the 4 and see what letter is on the other side? Or do you check does not have an even number, check the 7 and see what letter is on the other side? Which are the correct ones to choose? There's only 2 correct and there's 2 incorrect. So your task is to figure out which 2 to choose. So we're going to pick the 2 cards to decide if the rule is being violated. And then there was an independent variable, which was whether the rule was abstract or whether it was thematic. And in an abstract example, you would not be able to use knowledge from your personal experience, knowledge of the world. On the other hand, if it was thematic, then you could use knowledge of the word. So the example that we just took a look at, if there is a vowel on one side, there's an even number on the other side, that is an abstract rule, because to my knowledge, most of you probably have never run into that situation. Whereas something like if you studied, then you get a good grade, that would be a thematic rule. All right, the dependent variable was the mean number of correct cards chosen that tests the rules. So you could either get both of those correct, in which case you would get 2 out of 2. You could choose 1 correct card, 1 incorrect card, in which case you get 1 out of 2, and you can choose 2 incorrect cards, in which case you would get 0 out of 2. So let's take a look at some examples of this. So we had this one here. If a card is textured on one side, it must have a cow on the other side. Again, this is an example that you probably have no real world experience with. So this is an abstract rule. Another abstract rule, if a card has salt on one side, it must be pink on the other. Again, not something that typically happens. And the classic one, if a card has a vowel on one side, it must have an even number on the other side. That is, again, an abstract rule, not something that you can bring your world knowledge into to help you solve. On the other hand, we also had thematic rules. So thematic rules such as if a person is drinking beer, that person must be 21 or older. This is a situation that we come across in our society. This is a rule that we can draw upon world experience with. This is something that is thematic. It has world knowledge that we can draw upon. Another one, if you ride your bicycle after dark, you must wear reflective clothing. Again, something that pulls on our knowledge of darkness and ideas about how we're going to stay safe. And then finally, one that probably hit close to home for a lot of us, if you work overtime, you must be paid extra. So again, this is something that we can pull from our knowledge of the world, that if you do this, you are entitled to get this kind of schemas that we might have. So we had our abstract rules and we had our thematic rules. So what happened? How successful were we at choosing the two correct answers for these WASN selection tasks? All right, so here we have the results. So on the x-axis there, we have the two conditions. Was it an abstract rule that you were trying to figure out? Was it a thematic rule that you were trying to figure out? And then on the y-axis there, we have the mean number of cards that were correct. And again, remember, this can go all the way from a low of 0, you missed both cards, all the way up to a high score of 2. So the highest possible score is 2 out of 2. You chose the 2 correct cards. And what we see is that the mean number of cards that are correct for the abstract condition is right there. So it was about 1.3. So you got one card correct, and then 30% of the time you got the other card correct. And for the thematic, it was actually higher. So we were more able to solve these conditional syllogisms. We were more able to match that normative reasoning when we were with a thematic question and using help from our knowledge of the world rather than with an abstract question, an abstract syllogism. All right, so any questions on the results there? Is that clear? All right, so let's take a look at what that normative solution actually is. So what cards should we check according to normative reasoning? If we're asked if P then Q, which ones should we actually take a look at? And then we'll take a look at, does this violate normative reasoning? Did we actually violate normative reasoning? Is there a difference between what we should have done and what we actually did? Spoiler alert, we didn't score 2 out of 2. So yes, there is, but what is the violation that we actually did? Well, let's take a look at, backing up a bit, the actual original WASN selection task. The classic, if a card has a vowel on one side, then it is blue on the other side. So this was a situation when they did this task, I believe back in the 60s, when they actually had cards. If you're wondering why do they choose to phrase it as cards. So they actually had cards. So you would have a card with an A, you would have a card with an F, you would have one that is blue, you would have one that is red. Which of those cards do you need to flip in order to check if the rule, if a card has a vowel on one side, then it is blue on the other side, is being followed, if that rule is not being violated? So what should we do logically? What is the normative solution? Well, premise one, if a card has a vowel on one side, then it is blue on the other side. Premise two, the card has a vowel on one side. So if the card has a vowel on one side, according to the rule, the only thing that is possible is that it has blue on the other side. So if you take a look at a vowel, the rule says if it has a vowel on one side, then it is blue on the other side. So you take a look at A, you flip it over, you see blue, and you can say, hey, that rule is valid. The rule was followed. If, on the other hand, you take a look at A and you flip it over and you see red, you can say, well, wait a second. That premise said, that rule said if a card has a vowel on one side, then it has to be blue on the other side. This is red on the other side. That's a violation. The rule is invalid. So this is because the conclusion to this, the card is blue on the other side, this is the valid, one of the valid arguments that you can do with the conditional syllogism. This is affirming the antecedent. So if a card has a vowel on one side, if P, affirming the antecedent is P is true, the card has a vowel on one side, and if that is the case, then the conclusion has to be the card is blue on the other side, and if it's not, then the rule is invalid, the rule is being violated. So that's affirming the antecedent. What's another possibility? If a card has a vowel on one side, then it is blue on the other side. The card is red on one side. So let's say that we flip that red card there. And we flip the red card and we see that it's a K. Well, Well, if a card has a consonant on one side, it doesn't say anything about what should be on the other side. So in this case, the rule is not being violated. The rule is valid because it's only talking about cards with vowels and blue sides. And if we were to flip over that red card, however, and then we saw that it had an E on the other side, it had a vowel on the other side, in that case, that's a violation of the rule. Because if it has an E on one side, it has to be blue on the other side. So if you flip that red card and you see a vowel, it has violated that rule, because the conclusion from these two premises has to be the card does not have a vowel on the other side, and that is denying the consequent. So we have that if P then Q. Premise number 2, not Q. It's not blue, it's actually red. Conclusion, not P. The card does not have a vowel on the other side. That's denying the consequent. So those are the two valid arguments that we can use. On the other hand, there are two other things that we can do. There's two other cards that we can flip. If a card has a vowel on one side, then it is blue on the other side. So you take a look at that blue card and you say, you know what, I'm going to flip that blue card. And what I'm going to look for is I'm going to see if there's a vowel on that other side. Well, that's an error, and that's a mistake. Because if you take a look at that blue card and you flip it and you see an E, well, that gives you really no evidence whether the rule is being violated, right? Because if it's E on one side, it has to be blue on the other side. So far, so good. However, let's say that we take a look at that blue card and we flip it and we find a consonant. We see a K. This also gives us no evidence whatsoever, because this rule says nothing about consonants. Consonants can do whatever they want. Consonants can have whatever they want on the other side. So if we flip a card over and it's, if we take a look at the blue card and we flip it over and there's a K, it does not say if the card has a consonant on one side, then it's red on the other side. All it says is that if a card has a vowel on one side, it has to be blue on the other side. So if we flip over the card and we see a vowel, that tells us nothing about whether the rule is being violated. If we flip over the card and see a K, a consonant, that gives us no information whether this rule is being violated. And that's because that conclusion, the card has a vowel on the other side, is not guaranteed based on this logical argument, because this is the error of affirming the consequent. So if a card has a vowel on one side, it's blue on the other side. The card is blue. I'm going to affirm that Q statement. I'm going to affirm the consonant, and I incorrectly conclude that the card has a vowel on the other side, thinking that if I flip it over and see a K, that's a violation of the rule. But again, remember, this rule is about vowels, and it has nothing to say about consonants. So that's the first possible error. And then the last possible error, we start again with if a card has a vowel on one side, then it is blue on the other side. Premise number 2, the card does not have a vowel on the other side. So now we are denying the P statement. So we take a look at the F, and we say, hey, that F doesn't have a vowel. Let me flip it over. Let me see what's on that other side. And we flip it over and we see that it's red. It's not blue. That actually tells us nothing about whether the rule has been violated, because the rule is about vowels and blue cards, and it has nothing to say about consonants. However, let's say that we take a look at that consonant F and we flip it over and it's a blue card. You might say, well, that's a violation of the rule. Actually, it's not. That gives you no evidence whatsoever, because the statement is about vowels. The rule is about vowels. It says nothing about consonants. Consonants can have red cards, red sides on the other side. Consonants can have blue on the other side. Consonants can have whatever they want on the other side. All this rule is about vowels. You got a vowel, then it has to be blue. So we take a look at the card that does not have a vowel on one side. We incorrectly conclude that the card should not be blue on the other side, and that is denying the antecedent. And that, again, is one of those incorrect ways of reasoning. So the wasteland card selection task basically outlined the idea that, well, didn't outline the idea of normative reasoning, but it showed descriptively how we reason. So for the conditional if P then Q, the rule is that we should check P. So we should check the vowel and make sure that it's blue on the other side. If it's not blue on the other side, that's a violation of the rule, so that tells us something. And this is affirming the antecedent. And then we should also do the other valid argument, which is not Q. We should check not Q. So we should check the red card, flip it over, and make sure that it is not a vowel on the other side. So we check not blue, not Q, and make sure that it's not P, not a vowel on the other side. And that's the rule being valid, and that is denying the consequent. So when you are doing this cog lab, if a card is textured on one side, it must have a cow on the other. When you get familiar with conditional syllogisms, you can very easily see these statements and just reduce them to if P, then Q's. So you're like, all right, if a card is P, textured on one side, it must have Q, a cow on the other. And then you can just tell yourself, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to check P and I'm going to check not Q. So if it's textured on one side, I better check that textured card and make sure there's a cow on the other side. And if it's textured on one side, it must have a cow on the other. I better check not cow, not Q. So I'm going to check that goat and make sure that it's not textured on the other side. Those are your two cards. So you want to check the P and you want to check the not Q. If a card has salt on one side, P, salt on one side, it must be pink on the other. Q, pink on the other. You're going to want to take that P and you're going to want to check the P card. Make sure that it's Q on the other side. And then you're going to want to take a look at that Q and you're going to want to check not Q. You're going to want to check that purple card, make sure that it is not salt on the other side. Those are the only two that we need to take a look at. And one last one for the abstract rule. If a card has a vowel on one side, that's your P. It must have an even number on the other side. So you say to yourself, all right, it's P, not Q. So if it has a vowel on one side, I better check that vowel. And then Q is even number on the other. So I got to check not Q. I got to check that 7 and make sure that when I flip it over, there's no vowel on the other side. And notice how this gets a lot easier when we get into thematic rules. So if a person is drinking beer, that person must be 21 years or older. It completely makes sense to check the ages of the people drinking beer. So it completely makes sense to say, yeah, we're going to check P, the people that are drinking beer. But then we also want to check not Q, the people that are not 21 or older. And again, that makes complete sense. Because if you check that person who's 25 and they're drinking beer, what have you accomplished? Nothing. If you check that person who's 25 and they're drinking tea, nothing. You've accomplished nothing. You've checked nothing. What you need to do is you need to check that 16-year-old. You need to check that not Q, not 21, and make sure that what they're drinking when you flip their card is not beer. They better be drinking tea. And again, if you want to keep yourself safe when you're riding your bike after dark, you want to check the people that are riding their bike after dark. And then you also want to check the people that don't wear reflective clothing and make sure that they are riding during the day. So you want to make sure that if they're not wearing reflective clothing, you flip that card and they are riding their bike during the day. And then finally, if you want to be equitable to your employees, or if you're an employee and you want to make sure that you get paid for the work that you do, and you work overtime, if you're checking your pay stubs, you're going to want to check the weeks where you did work overtime. And then you're also going to want to check not the weeks that you got paid extra. You're going to want to check the weeks that you did not get paid extra and make sure that you did not work overtime during those weeks to make sure that you are being treated fairly. So what they found is that we should check P and we should check not Q. And what we actually do is we check P, which is affirming the consequent. We're pretty good at that one. We're pretty good at the first part of the if-then statement. However, we also tend to check Q, which is affirming the consequent. And that one is the error that we typically make. So we're also prone to making the error of flipping over that blue card and looking for a vowel or a consonant, not realizing that either one of those is possible and neither one of those violates the rule. So again, if a vowel has a number on, if a card has a vowel on one side, it has an even number on the other side. Our temptation is to go incorrect and flip that even number on the other side. And if you work overtime, you must be paid extra. Our temptation is to make the error of not checking when we're not paid extra, but checking when we were paid extra. And again, if we get paid extra and we see we worked overtime, great. If we got paid extra and we didn't work overtime, also not a violation of the rule that if you work overtime, you must be paid extra. So again, if we are logical, normative reasoning, descriptive reasoning, what do we actually do? Logically, we should accept. Descriptive reasoning, we do accept. Logically, we should not accept. Descriptive reasoning, we do not accept. What we should do, affirming the consequent, if P then Q, P is true, Q is true. Denying the consequent, if P then Q, Q is false, P must be false. We should not accept if P then Q, Q is true, P must be true. It's incorrect. And we should not accept denying the antecedent. If P then Q, Q is false, P must be false, also not correct. But what do we actually do? Well, under thematic conditions, under the good conditions where we're most successful, we actually do those. So if you recall, we were at about 1.4. We were there about half of the time making the correct decisions, always making the correct decision on checking that P card, and then half the time making the correct decision on checking the not Q card. That's under thematic conditions. So under thematic conditions, we come close to normative reasoning. However, under abstract conditions, we don't. Under abstract conditions, we affirm the antecedent. That's the correct one. We check P. But we also affirm the consequent. That's the incorrect one we make. We tend to check Q. We tend to check the outcome and say, okay, if the outcome is true, then the antecedent condition must be true, and that's not the case. And what we miss is denying the consequent. We don't check that not a vowel card, we don't check not Q, and we tend not to fall for denying the antecedent. All right, so we have these errors that we make under abstract conditions. We tend not to make those under thematic conditions. So now what does that kind of mean in terms of what we can do to help improve our reasoning? And the hint here is, what do we do when we're faced with an unfamiliar situation? So based on what we just saw, any suggestions on what we can do if we are trying to improve our reasoning out there in the real world? Or consequently, if we're trying to convince somebody else about our reasoning, what's the best way to explain it to them? Yep. Well, one way would be to prove their reasoning isn't correct. And that's basically what we're doing here, right? That's basically what you would do in a logic course, where you would lay out the conditional syllogisms and you would say, well, here's the logical reason. But oftentimes in a real world situation, you either don't have that time or you're dealing with somebody where you would have to back up multiple steps in order to explain that. And then, of course, then you don't have the time. But any ideas about, I'll give you one more hint. When were we better in the COGLAN? Under the abstract or thematic conditions? That one's a toss-up. It was the thematic conditions. So we were better under the thematic conditions. So one thing that you could possibly do, one strategy that you can use is if you have somebody in this situation here, where they are making errors, where they're affirming the consequent and they're denying the antecedent, and you try to explain to them, look, you're affirming the consequent, you can't do that. And they're like, of course I can do that. If P, then Q, Q, therefore P. That's the way that it works. If they're there, one way that you can help them very quickly get out of that is to change those abstract conditions into thematic conditions. So I'll give you two examples. I'll give you my favorite example, which is, I'll give you actually a few examples. My favorite one comes from Futurama, where they basically explain this idea of abstract conditions versus thematic conditions. They just came from a planet, they were escaping a planet where Star Trek tapes had landed and they were going on basically a Star Trek convention. I won't go into too much, but they come up with a plan and they put it into abstract conditions and thematic conditions. Here we go.
This is wrong. We shouldn't have abandoned them there.
I don't know. I'm feeling pretty good about it.
I didn't want to leave them either, Fry. But what were we supposed to do?
Well, usually on the show, someone would come up with a complicated plan, then explain it with a simple analogy.
If we can reroute engine power through the primary weapons and reconfigure them to Melvar's frequency, that should overload his electroquantum structure.
Like putting too much air in a balloon.
Of course. It's so simple.
All right, it's not simple at all. But notice what happened here. We had a very abstract example. If we can reroute the primary power from the weapons, if P, and then we use that to, I can't even remember what she said, use that to disrupt the positronic matrix, if Q, then we can do this, that's a conclusion. That's incredibly difficult to follow. But putting too much air into a balloon, it's like putting too much air in a balloon. I know how that works. If you put too much air in a balloon, then it will pop. We're going to put too much air in the balloon, therefore it's going to pop. Now it makes sense. So one thing that you can do when either you or somebody else is faced with an unfamiliar situation. So if you're faced with an unfamiliar situation and you're having trouble reasoning through it, and you're looking at it and you're like, oh my gosh, like I know there's an if P then Q in here somewhere, and I know there's other logical arguments being done in here, but I can't quite get a hold on it, and I think maybe I'm being lied to. Or if you're dealing with somebody and they're having a hard time following your reasoning, or maybe you're having a hard time convincing them that their logical reasoning is incorrect, one of the things you can do is change the abstract conditions of the argument that you're in and put it into a thematic condition, like putting too much air into a balloon. And a real world example of this, it's called analogical reasoning with a disanalogy. One of the best ways to convince people about a new idea, one of the best ways to make the argument that this new idea is good, that it should be accepted, is called analogical reasoning with a disanalogy. You basically say, my new idea is like this old idea that you really, really like. That's the that's the analogy part of it. However, it's got this one difference. That's the disanalogy. So I'll give you a few examples. So let's say that you are trying to convince somebody to give up their gas-powered car, and you're trying to tell them, look, gas-powered, not as good as electric-powered cars. They might have a lot of arguments why. They might not be able to understand certain things about, the electric car. One of the best things that you can do is use that analogy reasoning with a disanalogy and basically say, hey, you know what? An electric car is like a gas-powered car, but instead of filling it with fuel, you charge it like a phone. And all of a sudden they'll be like, oh, okay, it's like my gas-powered car. And now I know these other things about charging it with a phone. And now I can apply the reasoning of it's more convenient and it's actually pretty powerful, like my phone is. And they start to be able to understand it a little bit more. Incidentally, I find it really, you can kind of see the analogical reasoning in this example here. Because if you take a look at the gas pump and you take a look at the car charger, they are basically the same topology. They're basically the same shape. There is no reason they needed to make that look so much like a gas pump, except people will have an easier time reasoning with it because they'll be like, oh, I get gas pumping. I understand that. Oh, I understand this. It's like a gas pump, but it pumps electricity instead. I get it. All right, another example. You might not remember the dark days, but DVDs and CDs used to be the way that people listened to music and they watched movies. And that was it. That was the way that you did it. That was the accepted way. And then all of a sudden streaming came along. And in the beginning, people did not accept streaming very, very quickly. And one of the ways that they got past it was to basically say, well, what, streaming is like renting a movie, but you never have to return it and it starts instantly. And all of a sudden they're like, well, I understand what renting a movie is like. And man, is it horrible to have to return it and it doesn't start immediately. You know what? I like it. I like this idea of streaming. It now makes sense to me. And then taking it a step back on this, VHS to DVDs. So VHS were the tapes that people used to watch movies on. I think they were like 240p was their resolution. Anyways, anytime a new technology needs to get adopted, there's always a time frame under which it takes for most people to switch over. So there was a time frame between when most people were using VHS and most people started using DVD. In the modern era of people adopting new technologies, the switch from VHS to DVDs was the fastest switch that had ever occurred. It had occurred faster than any other medium switch up until that point. And there is one very, very good reason for this, is because the analogical reasoning with the disanalogy was already there and had already worked in our society, and it worked with music. So people used to listen to music exclusively on records. That was the medium. You wanted to buy music to listen to at home, you bought yourself a record. Eventually, cassette tapes started coming out. And people were reluctant. A lot of people were reluctant to give up their record player and, go to cassette tapes. And a lot of people probably got convinced when they were given that analogical reasoning with the disanalogy. Oh, a cassette tape is like a record player, but you can take it anywhere. And a cassette tape is like a record player, but it won't skip. So if somebody bumps your sound system, it's not going to skip. And a cassette player is like a record player, but it won't scratch. Your music is going to last forever. So eventually they adopted that. Then we went from cassettes importantly, to CDs. And again, it took a little bit of time. And people were like, well, a CD is like a cassette, except it's indestructible. A CD is like a cassette, except you'll never need a pen in order to fix it. A CD is like a cassette, except if you get it wet, it's not going to break, right? So it's got all these things. So people eventually switched between the cassette and the CD. And then what happened was the video cassette was being replaced by the DVD. And when that occurred, people had already gone through that argument. They had already come to the conclusion. So as soon as DVDs came around, people were like, oh, I get this. It's like a CD, but for movies. You know what? I'm on board. Let's do it. I love my CDs. Let's do the DVDs. And it is not a coincidence that CDs and DVDs are exactly the same size. Because laser discs, which also were like CDs, but were huge, they did not take off as easily. But when those DVDs first came out, it was the quickest adoption ever. And again, because that analogical reasoning had already occurred, people were already convinced, going from cassettes to CDs. All right, so analogical reasoning with a disanalogy, if you need to convince people, or you need to try to understand something that maybe is just a little bit beyond your logical grasp, you want to find the analogy with a theme that your audience understands. Find something that they already accept, and then explain to them using that analogy with the disanalogy. So this site is like Google, except we do this. This social media network is like Facebook, except that we do this. This new utensil is like a spoon, except it does this, right? So whatever theme your audience will understand, that's a way to help them understand. So again, if we're in that syllogism, we're in that conditional syllogism of the gender pay disparity, and you're trying to convince somebody about that, you can say, well, this is like a situation where you're trying to get onto a boat and there aren't enough seats, right? And then maybe people will be able to follow the logic a little easier because it's a theme that they understand. All right, any final questions about that? Comments? All right. So today we're going to end our class with reflecting on confirmation bias. So before we reflect on it, better introduce what it actually is. So confirmation bias, this is a reasoning bias, this is a judgment bias, a decision bias. This is the impulse to search for information in a way that confirms one's own beliefs. And it's also a way, an impulse to interpret information in a way that confirms your own beliefs. So this confirmation bias is how we search out information and then interpret that information in a way that fits with what we already believe. And that's a natural tendency that everybody does to a certain extent. And we're going to see the implications of that in just a little bit. So things like this is very problematic in a lot of these so-called echo chambers. So if you're looking at gender and race issues, if you're looking at vaccines, if you're looking at climate change, gun control, education methods, for example, regardless of which side of these debates you fall on, regardless of which side of these issues you fall on, the tendency is not to look on the other sides. So if you're pro-vaccine, you will tend to search out information that is also pro-vaccine. If you're anti-vaccine, you will tend to search out information that is anti-vaccine. And if some information comes down the pipe and it's novel, pro-vaccine people will interpret that to support their position. Anti-vaccine people will interpret that to support their position. Same thing with climate change, gender race issues, gun control, education methods. And you can see why it's so difficult to change people's minds. If you can take, not only do you seek out information that confirms your own beliefs, but you can take the same information, and with one person, it will confirm their beliefs, and with the other person, it will confirm their opposite beliefs. So we'll see an example of that in just a little bit. But then you also get this with conspiracy theories. So this is the example that I wanted to get to. So this is a story from Neil deGrasse Tyson, who knew a person who did not believe in the moon landing. They believed that the moon landing was fake. And you might think to yourself, well, how can somebody fall for these conspiracy theories that have so much evidence against them, so much evidence that they're actually not true? And this is a great example of how that can happen.
Someone I know didn't believe we went to the moon. So I said, what kind of evidence would convince you? He said, images of the landing site of the Apollo missions. So I said, okay, here's a website where we sent a orbiter to the moon so that it was close enough, because ground-based telescopes, they don't have the resolution to see the landing sites. But if you get close enough to the moon, you can. It photographed the entire surface of the moon, and there were the landing sites, and you saw the rover tracks, the base for the lunar module. That night, he went home and found it. Then he came back and says, well, NASA could have faked that. I'm done with you. We have no more to talk about, because he's not ready to be convinced.
So I just want to make a few comments on this. So notice we have a piece of evidence, photographs from the moon, right? We have a piece of evidence, photographs from the moon. And if you showed them to somebody who believed in the moon landing, and you show them those photographs of the moon, they would say, well, I'm very convinced. I still believe in the landing on the moon. You take somebody who does not believe that we land on the moon, that believes in the conspiracy theory that the moon landing was faked, and you show them the same evidence. Confirmation bias means that they interpret that information in a way that still fits with their beliefs. So instead of this individual being more convinced that the moon landing was real and less convinced that the moon landing was faked, he actually probably became more convinced that the moon landing was faked, because here were these photos that came from NASA, and they looked like they were on the moon, but they were faked. They were clearly faked. And if NASA's faking these photos, then why would it, unless the moon landing didn't actually occur? So again, we have this interpretation of this piece of evidence. Confirmation bias means that that same evidence, take a look at the photos. He saw the photos, will push one person towards their beliefs and will push another person in the opposite direction, again, towards their beliefs, but in that opposite direction. So that brings us to our look at confirmation bias and how it might occur and what occurs. So what we did was you had an assignment, and in this assignment, you were randomly assigned to read one of two articles. So you were either assigned to read an article, and both of them had to do with gender gap, the gender pay gap. And one of them, the Harvard study, Gender Pay Gap Explained Entirely by Work Choices of Men and Women. This was a pro-choices is the cause of the gender pay gap article. This was one that presented evidence that it's the choices that people make that can explain the gender pay gap. And then half of you were assigned to another article that said it was actually sexism that is causing the gender pay gap. So women ask for raises, promotions as often as men, but receive less. So this one was basically saying that it's sexism. Here's some evidence that sexism is actually causing the gender pay gap. So half of you got one, half of you got the other. And what you were asked was, how much do you believe that the gender pay gap is due to sexism in the workforce versus choices that women make? So how much do you believe that it's because of sexism and because of choices? And then you were able to answer this anywhere between 0 and 100. So you could say, well, you know what? I believe it's 70% sexism and 30% choices. So your numbers had to add up to 100. You could say it's 100% sexism and 0% choices. You could say it's 80% choices, 20% sexism. Basically, it was asking you how hard do you believe, or how strong are your beliefs in premise 1 and premise 2 being true? How much of it is choices? Actually, premise 2 being true, how much of it is choices, versus how much you believe premise 3 is true, how much of it is sexism. So that was the dependent measure. The independent variable was the article type. So did you read the one that gave evidence for sexism, or did you read the one that gave evidence for choices? So again, did you read the one that gave evidence for choices, the Harvard study, or did you read the article about women asking for raises? And then finally, the dependent variable wasn't your rating of sexism and choices in the beginning, it was your change in your ratings. So we only have to look at your change in your sexism rating because, again, the two of them needed to add up to 100. So if you know sexism is 80%, you know immediately choices is 20%. So we looked at the change in the percent sexism before and after reading the article to take a look at, was confirmation bias at work here? Were people interpreting these articles and the evidence provided in them in a way that confirmed their own beliefs, much like that individual with the moon landing interpreting the pictures as, well, that had to have been faked. All right, so I don't know why I have that twice, before and after reading the article. Let's take a look at the results. So we're going to take a look at the results from the two articles separately. So this one here, this is the evidence for choices. All right, this one here is the evidence for choices. So on the x-axis, we have sexism before, and then on the x-axis, we have y-axis, we have sexism after. So this is sexism before reading the article. What percentage did you think it's due to sexism before you read the article? What percentage do you think is due to sexism after you read the article? This here is not the actual data, but this is the line of no change in your mind. This is the line of not changing any of your beliefs. Okay, so we're just going to fit a line to this. If you started at 60, you ended at 60. If you started at 100, you ended at 100. So we're just going to have that line there as this line of no change in beliefs. Okay, and then we're going to compare what actually happened. And what actually happened is this. So each of those dots is a individual, and basically what we can see is there's kind of three distinct patterns here in terms of what occurred after reading this article. So we have some individuals here, and those individuals did not change their mind at all. And this is actually, believe it or not, a rational decision to make. Because you can take a look at this article and you can say, you know what? I don't believe it. I've read the evidence, I've considered the evidence, but it just doesn't seem convincing to me, and I don't believe it. So my sexism before was 60%, and my percent sexism after reading the choices article is now also 60%. So that's a completely rational decision to make. You just said, I don't believe the article, and that's fine. We have another group of people here, and these are the people who actually updated their beliefs. So these are the people who basically said, oh, you know what? Previously, my percent sexism was 80%. I thought 80% of the gender pay gap was due to sexism. And now I actually think it's like 45. So these are the individuals that took a look at the evidence and they changed their mind and they went in the, again, rational direction. If you read an argument that is, or an article that is giving you evidence that is due to choices, rationally, you can either stay exactly where you are, which are these individuals here, or you can say, okay, I'm going to update my beliefs to incorporate this new evidence, and now my percent sexism is actually going to change and my percent choices is actually going to go up. So that's the other group of people. And thankfully, notice that most of you are sitting in these two groups. So most of you are either in this group or in this group. And again, that is somebody who's thinking critically, that is somebody who's weighing the evidence, and that is somebody that is trying to do a normative reasoning type of conclusion. However, we also have these individuals here. And we are going to come back to those individuals right there. These were individuals that read the article that gave evidence for choices and then concluded that the reason for the gender pay gap is even more due to sexism than they previously believed. So they previously thought that sexism was at 70% of the explanation for the gender pay gap. And now after reading an article for choices, they're like, well, it's 80% actually. So they went in the opposite direction. So remember that, because now we're going to take a look at what happened with the other article. So this is the other article. This is the one that gave evidence for sexism. This is the one where women ask for the same amount of promotions, but actually get fewer promotions. Once again, we have sexism before the article on the x-axis, sexism after the article on the y-axis. That is your line of no change. So if beliefs do not change, they will fall on that line right there. And what we actually have is these are the results right here. So we can fit a line to that. And once again, you can see that in this case, we have some people who did not change their mind whatsoever. So they had a percentage of sexism previous to reading the article. The article did not convince them one way or the other. And they said, you know what, I came in there thinking it was 45. I'm going to leave thinking it's 45% sexism. I did not find this article convincing whatsoever. We have another group of individuals that basically updated their beliefs and basically said, hey, I saw this evidence that it's actually due to sexism. I'm going to update my belief. I used to think that sexism was the cause of 60% of the gender pay gap, but now I actually think it's about 95%. This was a very convincing article, and I'm going to update my belief. So again, those two choices, not going to update my belief at all, going to keep it the same because I'm not convinced of the evidence, or I'm going to take that evidence and I'm going to update my belief in the direction of the evidence. Both of those are rational choices. However, once again, we also have people that went the other way. We also have individuals who said, you know what, I used to think that this gender pay gap was due to choices. And now after reading this article giving me evidence that it's actually due to sexism, I believe even more that it's due to choices. So they went the opposite way. So just by recap, we did find mostly belief updating, which is something that is very encouraging. I mean, we're in a university situation. We're here to update our beliefs. I'm a very strong believer in the idea that if you come into university and you leave university the same person, you've wasted a lot of the opportunity in a university. So we did have some belief updating. So people's beliefs changed due to the information that they processed. So we had that for evidence for choices. People changed how much they thought or reduced how much they thought the gender pay gap was due to sexism. We have the same effect in the opposite direction for evidence for sexism. People increased their belief in how much the gender pay gap is due to sexism. For both articles, we also had belief perseverance. So in both cases, we had individuals that maintained their beliefs even after getting some evidence for the other direction. But really surprisingly, we had people who changed their beliefs in the opposite direction from the evidence that they were just presented. So they read the choices article, and now they believe that the gender pay gap is even more due to sexism. They read the sexism article, and now they believe that the gender pay gap is due even more to choices. And this is known as the backfire effect. And this is a specific kind of belief perseverance where this counter evidence to your own belief actually strengthens the original belief rather than making it weak. It actually pushes somebody further in the opposite direction than it should in terms of the evidence being presented. So the results in this, mostly we get belief updating and cognitive flexibility, which again is amazing to see in a university population in students as well. So congratulations on that. Most of us updated our beliefs. Most of us showed cognitive flexibility. And this is one of the reasons why echo chambers are very dangerous to critical thinking and to just belief formation in general, because your beliefs can be updated, but you do need to take a look at that counter evidence. You do need to actually search out and find the truth. And if you self-select the information, sometimes it's very difficult and you don't know it, but you fall into that confirmation bias way of doing it. So we did have some belief perseverance, and this was where people did not change whatsoever. But again, importantly, we had that backfire effect. We had less, but we still had some. So for the evidence for choices, that is about 6% of people backfired. For evidence for sexism, that's about 9% of people backfired. And usually when this occurs, and when people cling to a belief, not cling to a belief, but actually go through a backfire effect, usually that is a case where the argument or the issue is something that either ties very closely into their identity, and or it's a very emotional topic for them. So this gender pay gap in our society, there's a lot of ideas about what pay actually means. So a lot of people tie their worth to how much they're making. A lot of people tie their status in the community in terms of how much they're making, like keeping up with the Joneses. A lot of people tie their identity into how much they're making. So when you have arguments about why that might not be, or that attacks that identity. So for example, if you have an argument that says in your own personal belief, well, I am highly skilled and I am highly hardworking, those are two things I know about me. I'm the highly skilled, hardworking person. That is something about my identity. You ask anybody, hey, what do you know about Joe? Oh, Joe, man, is that guy hardworking. Man, is that guy highly skilled. And that hardworking and highly skilled is why Joe believes that he gets paid a lot of money. If you call that into question, you're attacking his identity. You're attacking that idea that he's not hardworking and that he's not very skilled. And that can lead to a very large backfire effect where people dig in their heels and they're not going to make the changes that you want or that they might need to make. So one thing to learn from this is you want to present arguments to an individual and you want to present change to an individual in a way that does not attack a person's identity. And I know we just got a couple of minutes here, but I do want to mention this one. This is one of the reasons why diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives were very much pushed back against by a lot of people in the workforce. And the reason is that the reason for diversity, equity, and initiative, the justification for it was an attack on identity. Basically, they said that people who came from minorities have been discriminated against in the hiring process, and they've been discriminated against in the promotion process. Therefore, they're not represented. The corollary to that was that you who have been hired and you who have been promoted have not earned it. So all of those feelings of status and all of that feeling of identity that you have, that, oh, I got this promotion and I got this pay and I got this job because I'm good at it, that was attacked. And that's why there was a lot of pushback on these initiatives. If, on the other hand, they went to the people and they said, hey, you know what? Diversity in a company actually makes your company stronger. And diversity in a company will actually make you more successful. It'll make your company more successful, which means that there's more money for raises, there's more promotions, there's going to be more expansion. There's actual scientific evidence that diversity does increase the profitability of companies. If they came at it from that position, nobody's identity is getting attacked, nobody's status or beliefs are getting attacked, there's no huge emotional, it would have been way more able to be accepted, and you wouldn't get those two green dots there, which are people pushing hard back in the other direction. All right, any final questions or comments before we wrap up for the day? All right, that is it. So next time we will finish up our look at judgments, decisions, and reasoning. But until then, we are done for the day.